Hello, everyone. Welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host for today, Tabetha Moreto. Our guest today is Carol Ireland, CEO and Managing Director of Epilepsy Action Australia. She is a strong and active advocate for people living with epilepsy. Today, we're going to talk about how Australians and health professionals are unaware of risk of epilepsy-related deaths and the new partnership forged between Epilepsy Action Australia and SUDEP Action. Without further ado, welcome to the show, Carol. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much, Tabitha. Very important to be raising some awareness of these issues.
Yes, my pleasure. So, Carol, can you please tell the audience more about yourself and your organization?
Yeah, sure. So I've actually been working with Epilepsy Action Australia for over a decade now, about 11 years. I have a brother with epilepsy, and when I joined this organisation, I thought I knew all about epilepsy, and I came to know that I don't know very much at all, or I didn't. I've learned a lot in that last 10 years. So Epilepsy Action Australia is the largest and the oldest epilepsy support organisation in Australia. We've been assisting people in the community for some 65 years. And we do a range of things. I guess the most important thing is we provide support, advice, guidance, resources to people immediately impacted by epilepsy or the parents of children with epilepsy. And we also provide training to others who need to know about epilepsy in the community, like teachers, nurses, carers, sporting groups, those sorts of people as well. We will train in how to identify seizures, how to apply seizure first aid, how to give emergency medication if that's required in a particular case. Epilepsy is very, very complex. A lot of people think of it as a tonic-clonic seizure or the old grand mal seizure that you see depicted in the media. But in fact, there are some 45 different kinds of seizures and epilepsy syndromes, and they do have different implications, sometimes different causes, and require different interventions. So it's actually a very, very complex area, and we like to see ourselves as the people that have the information to help in anything to do with epilepsy.
I see. This sounds very interesting. And speaking of the types of epilepsy, Carol, can you please explain what are the different types of epilepsy out there? Yeah,
sure. As I mentioned, 40 or more different kinds of seizures and syndromes. So most people do recognise a tonic-clonic seizure or a grand mal seizure. Somebody would actually fall to the ground, lose consciousness, and it's a convulsive seizure. They convulse. And it might be, several minutes that they're unconscious, and then slowly they'll regain consciousness. And after a period of rest, they'll get on with their lives. But there are other forms. So there is something called absence seizures. Now, if you could imagine a child perhaps in school and every now and again they drift off. They might, stop paying attention, literally drift off. If you were having a conversation with somebody having absence seizures, they might just stop for a few seconds mid-sentence and then take up again. Now, believe it or not, these people are actually having seizures, small, what used to be called petit mal seizures, and very hard to learn something new in school, if you're actually having these on a regular basis. The most common kind of seizure is actually a complex partial seizure or a focal seizure. Now, imagine if you were talking with me and I started to make very strange repetitive movements. I might be tugging at my clothes with my hand. I might start to make some funny repetitive facial movements. Actually, in this kind of epilepsy, which as I said is the most common, I don't know that's happening. I'm having seizures. I appear to be conscious, and you can imagine this is mistaken for anything from daydreaming to somebody being intoxicated, somebody being very strange, inverted commas, and so on. So it's a lot harder to explain those sorts of seizures than it is the ones well known. And then you've got the really devastating syndromes, and there really are some terrible syndromes that affect children. There's one that's called Dravet syndrome, and in this, the child can be having many seizures and many seizures per day sometimes, and all that activity is sort of further compromising their already compromised brains. And look, in some of the childhood epilepsies, very sadly, a large proportion of the children actually don't survive into adulthood. So there is that really devastating end of epilepsy as well, where it can and does take lives.
I see. This sounds like a very complicated or rather complex condition, and it also sounds very dangerous. So can you tell us, Carol, how can epilepsy be treated or managed?
Yeah, there are a number of different ways, but the frontline treatment is medication. If you were to have one seizure, you won't be diagnosed with epilepsy, but if you have a second seizure and there's no obvious reason, in other words, intoxication or very high temperature, if there's no other obvious reason and you've had a second seizure, you will most likely be diagnosed with epilepsy. You know, it might take some time for the type of epilepsy to be identified and the best treatment to be decided. But typically you'll be given a medication. And there are different forms of medications for different types of epilepsy. So one will be prescribed and then you'd be monitored. Now, for some people, that first medication, may work. It may reduce seizures. It certainly hasn't cured the epilepsy, but what we're trying to do here is controlling those seizures. If that one doesn't work, there would be another medication trial, and sometimes there's a combination of medications that are trialed. So, in the really tough cases, it might be 4 or 5 different medications that are trialed, and they just fail to control the seizures. But for about 65% of people with epilepsy, medication will be the thing that will bring their seizures under control. People think that surgery is a very common treatment, and surgery can be successful, but not for the majority. So of all the people with epilepsy, it's only about 1% who are suitable candidates for surgery. And it's where you can actually see a little bit of damage, a mark, a scratch. You can actually see something under the testing of something on the brain, and they literally remove that part of the brain if it's safe to do so. But as I said, only about 1% of people with epilepsy. And there are some dietary treatments as well, and there's some emerging treatment, including the trialling of medicinal cannabis. So a range of new things always coming out, but at the moment around 35% of people still really do suffer with what we call intractable epilepsy or medication-resistant epilepsy.
It's a good thing to know that there are several treatments available for people who have epilepsy. And now let's talk about the risk. Who are at risk of getting epilepsy?
At risk of getting epilepsy, anyone can actually get epilepsy. I mean, the causes are many. So, it may be that you have a genetic form of epilepsy, which is easy to identify once there's gene testing. Maybe running in the family, it might be more than one child in the family that has epilepsy. It can be accident-related, so if you've had a car accident and bumped your head, or if you've been in a sporting accident and had an injury to the head, anything that injures the head can potentially injure the brain and cause epilepsy. And then there are what we call comorbidities. So, for instance, somebody who has another condition, let's say a stroke or a brain tumour, there are a range of different conditions where epilepsy could a comorbid indication. So many different forms of epilepsy, many different causes. If you were to chart, it would be that epilepsy, the incidence of epilepsy is highest in the very young and the elderly, but obviously with accidents and the like, you can develop epilepsy at any age.
That's very interesting because, to tell you the truth, Carol, there was a time where I thought only like a specific group of people are at risk of getting epilepsy, but thank you for explaining to me that everyone could be at risk of getting this condition.
Absolutely, and look, most of us know someone with epilepsy, in our families or friends or whatever, but, they're often the similarities end. It's all different kinds of epilepsy, and it could happen to any one of us. I mean, the thing we say about epilepsy, it doesn't discriminate by age or race or gender. It can happen to anyone. And of course, it may be that you're in that luckier group where the epilepsy or the seizures can be controlled. But of course, the risks are far greater when the seizures can't be controlled.
Very well said. I agree with you. Epilepsy does not discriminate. Carol, let's talk about this new partnership between Epilepsy Action Australia and SUDEP Action. So what's so special about this new partnership between these two organizations?
Yeah, well, for explaining first of all what SUDEP is, S-U-D-E-P, SUDEP stands for Sudden Unexpected Death in Epilepsy. Now, most people have heard of SIDS. You would have heard of SIDS, where a young baby would pass away and there was often not an obvious cause of death. And there have been many, research programs into SIDS, and thankfully the rate of death has gone down considerably. But SUDEP is a little bit similar, I should say. It's where someone with epilepsy who are otherwise well, they have a diagnosis of epilepsy, but they're otherwise well, they die suddenly and unexpectedly, and there's no obvious cause of death. Very often it would happen during sleep, so there's often not a witness, but there's no evidence that the person has necessarily had a seizure or anything else has happened. They've just passed away in their sleep most commonly. We don't know quite why that's the case at the moment. Researchers are still investigating, and they're looking at possibilities like the effect of seizures on breathing and the heart. But you can imagine it's an absolutely traumatic experience when this happens. It may be that it's your partner or your child, but somebody, typically too, they're young adults. It can happen to children, but typically young adults, and they seem well, but they just pass away in their sleep. So very traumatic. Unfortunately, most of the families affected say they've never heard of SUDEP. Nobody's ever mentioned it to them until they actually lost their loved one. So there's, as well as the grief, there's incredible shock around the fact that this thing called SUDEP even exists. So the importance of the partnership, what we've done is we've partnered with basically the international leading organisation that's looking at SUDEP, and it is SUDEP Action in the United Kingdom, and they are taking some fantastic steps to ensure research and understanding and education, because there are things that people can do to minimise risk. So the more we can get the information out there, then the better that is. So the partnership is between our organisation and SUDEP Action to actually bring awareness and resources to the Australian people around SUDEP and make sure that people do know what it's about and that they can minimise their risks.
Excellent news. I'm very happy to hear that your organization and SUDEP Action will also have a great impact on Australian people, especially regarding this condition that, like what you mentioned earlier, that a lot of people don't even know about.
No, that's right. Well, I mean, in Australia, I think in general, it's about 1 in 1,000 people with epilepsy that are affected by SUDEP. And in Australia, that's about 150 deaths per year. And you might say that's a small number, but it's too many for those families that are going through such grief. And they often say, well, if only I knew. There are some really key things like lifestyle factors, getting enough sleep, taking your medication exactly on time, how much medication you're supposed to take and taking it at the exact time you should, avoiding some triggers. It might be that late nights and alcohol might be seizure triggers. Basically, what these people need to do is manage their seizures as well as possible so that they're reducing them. If the seizures are controlled, then the risk of SUDEP goes down considerably. And look, I have to say too, it's not all people with epilepsy that are at risk of sudden unexpected death. Some syndromes, some seizure types are actually a higher risk than others. So it's quite important to talk to some professionals about that and get the understanding of exactly where your particular type of seizure and epilepsy fits. And that's what the partnership is about, and it's about Epilepsy Action Australia growing its resources and its knowledge and helping people in Australia.
Fantastic. Now, before we go, Carol, what is your main takeaway message to all of our listeners?
Yes, I think what we want people to do is be aware of SUDEP, but don't be afraid. Educate yourself. So it's really important to know it exists, know that it's a risk, and then do some education to see what you can do to minimise that risk. So be aware, but not afraid, and seek some advice. Certainly come to us. We'd be happy to help.
Excellent message. Now, for those interested in contacting your organization, how can they get in touch with you guys?
Yeah, sure. They can certainly find us on the website at epilepsy.org.au, and we've also got a very, very active Epilepsy Action Australia Facebook page. And, of course, they can call us on 1300 374537.
Thank you very much, Carol, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Tabitha. Thank you.
And that was Carol Ireland, CEO and Managing Director of Epilepsy Action Australia. We've just been talking about the new partnership between her organization and SUDEP Action. We also discussed all about epilepsy, its causes, treatment, etc. If you like this interview, transcripts and archives are available at www.hpr.fm. We're on all social media platforms, so don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe. We're also available for download on SoundCloud and iTunes. I'm Tabetha Moreto, and you're listening to Health Professional Radio.